Vignesh, welcome to our Research Mavericks podcast. We are very excited to have you here. For our audience, Vignesh is the CEO and founder of Research Defender, a company that is really deeply incorporated into the market research space. So, Vignesh, welcome again. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background, experience, and how did you get into the research space?
I've been in the industry since 2013, and what got me into the industry was living in New Orleans. I was at the MBA program at Tulane, and I entered the industry joining a company called Federated Sample. Federated Sample connected buyers of data with sellers of data, and I subsequently they were called Lucid, of course. And I was there for several years. I decided that at some point data quality was getting worse and worse across the ecosystem, and research and sample were evolving pretty significantly, and our goal was to fight against the fraud. And we've been doing that for about 5 years now. And our again, like I said, our goal is to elevate the data quality in the space. As you can imagine, that's one of the pillars that we all stand on, and that's the project for the last 5 years.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vignesh. Maybe tell our audience a little bit about fraud in this space, how you guys are correcting it, and why you started Research Defender. Just give us a little bit more color on that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think our industry is very complex. It has a lot of moving parts. And when you have a system like that, you probably need a solution that is dedicated and focused on fighting fraud specifically. And we were able to do that as a small team, independently with focus on the issue. And that's primarily how I think we can be successful. With regards to your question about how and the details around fraud, it is rampant. Unfortunately, it is rampant. Every single minute, every single hour, we have a lot of people trying to defraud the industry. And as you can imagine, right, wherever there's money, there's going to be fraud. And that's what it is. As far as the solutions goes, it's basically all technology and API based. One of the challenges that we have is to solve fraud on a scale issue. So, for example, if you have 10 people in your panel or you deal with 10 respondents, it's easy to tell who's a fraudster or not. But if you have 100, if you then have 1,000, if you have a million, then you start to have issues. And our goal is to help use technology to identify and fight against these issues.
Perfect, perfect. So maybe just tell us a little bit about what kind of technology you're using at Research Defender to fight fraud. Of course, we don't need to go into any proprietary technology, but we just want to understand how that is done, how you guys are going around it.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I would say that the first thing any company should do is to layer up, right? So one example that I like to share is, like jackets in the winter. Like if you have a really cold winter, like you are not going to just wear one layer of clothing, right? You're going to have multiple layers, and that's probably the best way to fight against the cold. And same analogy applies to fraud as well, because if you have one tool, you basically have a single point of failure, right? And our goal is to layer up multiple tools, multiple APIs, and I'm happy to share some details for sure. So, for example, you probably have to look at the machine types of details, right? So, if you have individuals who are not necessarily in the country that they say they are in, then that's a good sign of fraud. A second sign of fraud is if they're using some automation tools. Usually, if someone is using an automated tool, you can tell that they are copying and pasting, they are getting answers from somewhere else, so on and so forth. So that's like a second approach to fight against it. A third approach to fight against fraud is to realize that many people who take these surveys, they're not fraud in the sense that they are trying to specifically or actively defraud something. What they're trying to do is to earn points and money, right? So the goal is, how do you stop that as at the source? How do you make sure that their incentive to overindulge in surveys is taken? So my recommendation is definitely invest in technology, whoever is listening to this, and also layer up, right? Because there are multiple approaches to fighting this issue, and we cannot and shouldn't be taking just one single approach.
Thank you. I can definitely relate to your analogy about winter and multiple layers, Vignesh, being stationed here in Montreal.
Montreal, yes. Yeah.
And the -40 temperatures that we have in Jan and Feb. So I
Exactly.
can absolutely relate to it. And from a data quality perspective as well. 100% agree with you,
Yeah.
and keep doing the great work. So, just to go double click on that, maybe tell us a little bit about what kind of projects you guys are working with some of your clients.
Yeah. Um, when we work with any given client across the ecosystem, we typically work with them on a product, on a technology basis. So anytime a transaction happens, that transaction has to be tested for validity. Okay. So whether this is on the survey platform side, whether this is on the supply side, whether this is on the exchange side, or some intermediate technology, let's say, our goal is to use APIs and product based solutions to ensure that anyone going into a given survey is valid. Now, what's interesting is that every part of that process, you have a different challenge. So, for example, the people who are sourcing, or let's say the panels or the suppliers, as we call them, they have a challenge of fraud more than duplication, because they are sourcing from the internet, they are sourcing from lists that are available, they are sourcing from potentially, like, Facebook ads, or Google ads, and so on and so forth. And when you open the hose out to the internet, you can imagine that fraud can be pretty significant, um, uh, that comes through there. Versus when you go downstream, when you go closer to, let's say, exchanges or aggregators, or companies that are hosting and programming the survey, in those cases you have a bigger problem with duplication, because ultimately there are a lot of panelists that sit across the that straddle the environment, right? So when you get closer to the the data collection piece, you see more bigger problem of duplication, although of course fraud still exists. And then depending on what kinds of surveys you're doing, so B2B has different kinds of challenges. You may want to be more stringent, or perhaps for the fact that you are paying typically more money for a B2B survey, your requests from a respondent can probably be higher, right? So for example, you can ask them to share their geolocation, you can ask them to share, let's say, some specific information that can validate their legitimacy. Versus on a consumer study, you have less leeway, because a lot of these surveys are lower paying, and probably they're quicker turn, and so on and so forth, so you don't have that bandwidth, let's say, right? So it is kind of a canvas, and you got to paint what you need to paint wherever you want to. But there are some ground rules that are very basic, like duplication is typically frowned upon. People who are using some third party proxy and routing through two countries to access your survey, that's also frowned upon in both cases, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of aspects there, but those are some of the pieces.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Vignesh, would you have any data points on how big, in terms of the dollar terms, this fraud in the industry is globally, North America, just very high level, so
Yeah.
that users can understand the importance of this kind of protection?
Yes, so I actually do have numbers for that one. And like you said, it changes day to day, by the way. And one quick thing that I'll share up front is that you may have noticed that sometimes you have a lot of fraud, and then the fraud kind of like goes away, and then it comes back again, and then kind of goes away. And there's a huge ebb and flow, is what I would call it in the industry, right? But to share some numbers, if you look at duplication, and let's start there, and like I mentioned, duplication is different for different people, but I'll zoom out and give you a very high level number. You would see about 15% on average, so maybe 10% on the lower end, and let's say 17-20% on the higher end of duplication for every single survey that exists, because people are getting reinvited. Sometimes aggregators are kind of fishing from the same pools, as it were. And you tend to see that you have a very high duplication, again depending on where you sit. So let's just use, let's say, 15% for that number. Fraud rates again can range as well, right? So it's actually interestingly not too dissimilar from that number. You would see about 10-15% on the lower end, and sometimes you see 20-25% of people using some kind of nefarious VPN, or hopping through some third party proxy, or using an emulator, let's say. Subnets is another one where people try to manipulate their IP to try and come in again into surveys, and so on and so forth. And so that's basically, let's say, 15 plus, let's say, another 15-20 is about 30 to 35% right there. Okay. So then you have poor open ends. Okay. And poor open ends, again, we've all in this industry seen some pretty nasty or unfriendly open ends, which are completely not relevant to the survey or the study, in our time in this industry, I'm sure. So you have, let's say, another, 5-6% there, which is, let's say, above average. So it is lower than the raw fraud and the raw duplication. So now we're up to, if my math is correct, about 35% on the lower end to, let's say, 40% on the higher end. And then you have the hyperactive survey takers, right? So people who are excessively engaged in survey taking. Let's be honest, like, how many times have any of us taken a survey in the last few days? I might have taken one because I traveled and I got like a, Hilton survey to take, but usually it's not that high. And then we see people taking high double digits, right? So 50, 60, 80, and if not even triple digits. And that at that point, that individual is really not trying to keep the best interest of the survey in mind. They're just clicking away trying to get some points. So if you add all of that up, I mean, it's pretty crazy. Like, it could easily cross 50%, I would say, on a given day. And as you can imagine, like, if you have an Amazon that 50% of the products that you buy you're returning, that's not a great business model. So I do think that we are in a position where we really need to tighten down on this.
Wow. So one out of every two responses that people are getting could be fraudulent, right?
Yes,
Am I getting this correct?
yeah, pretty much. But keep in mind that that is upfront, right? Hopefully, and it's not just about us. There's a lot of good competitors of us also helping in this industry. A lot of
Yeah.
people have, their own solutions as well. So just to be super clear, this is what is happening upfront. So these are not getting into the survey; these are
Yeah.
getting blocked. But as you can imagine, that is not a good sign either, right?
Right.
And then you have the rejection rates at the tail end, which, of course, on the lower side, it could be 5 to 10%, that I hear from consumer folks, and then B2B. As you can imagine, the door can be completely open there, right? So in short, what I'm saying is that there's a lot of stuff that is cleaned up upfront, and yet we still have high rejection rates downstream as well.
Got it. Makes sense. Let me just ask you another question on that. So, okay, so we all understand and agree that fraud is rampant in the industry and we need to do something about it. Let's say if somebody were to implement Research Defender or one of the competitors, what is the typical ROI? Is that something that your clients measure, that you guys take a look at?
Yes, of course. So you look at it on two sides, right? So on one hand, let's talk about the easier one, which is more obvious to perhaps look at, which is that at the end of the day, a researcher's cleaning time and refielding and having different quotas met and so on and so forth, that should go down. Okay. And I would say that we got to think about it like a one of those curves that gets closer and closer to zero, but it doesn't quite hit zero. So for example, let's say you use the duplication and the fraud tool. Hopefully your rejection rate goes from, I'm just again making a number up, let's say from 15% to, let's say, 10%. And then you use the text analytics tool, that drops it from another 10 to, let's say, 7%. And then when you add the other tools that track professional survey taking and so on and so forth, you get closer to 5-4%, so on and so forth. So let's say that you have a target to reject lower data points. That is one way to look at it, which, and people look at that. But then you have the other side, right? Like, just because you may not have an open end in the survey, but you may get flooded with people from a different country or location because they want to get the $2 or $1, right? And in that case, you're looking at the rejection rates upfront, right? So how many duplicates came? And in many cases, the good news is that these are not like let's say, abstract numbers. You can literally say, okay, this individual who is here and this is their address or this is their digital fingerprint has been duplicated 13 times for the same person. And the other piece that I would like to say is that while the problem is big, the good news, in a way, if you want to think about it, is that the people who create these issues are not that many, right? It's a bunch of click farms, people who are trying to get into the surveys over and over again. And so the list of people is low, but the damage they create is high. So that could be taken both as a positive or negative, depending on your point of view.
Right, both positive and negative. I take your point on that. Right,
Yes.
it's not. I mean, yeah, you have a concentrated group of call it bad actors,
Yes.
but at the same time, they can do a lot of damage in the industry where
Yes.
data collection is key to any meaningful insight. Right, so yeah, point taken,
Yep.
understood.
Yep.
Now, let's look at this from another lens, Vignesh. Now, we are talking about location of the respondent. We are talking about identifying some other criteria. How do you guys make sure that privacy is met and there's no problems around that from the regulation perspective?
Yeah, so that's a really good and important question, and I'll also say something else up front related to that. First point is the fact that the more you have privacy, the less fraud there can be, and vice versa. So if you have, you know, less privacy, you have, less fraud. Basically, I think I flipped that. And you have to think about it as two opposite ends of a spectrum. The more you have one, the less you have other, and vice versa. And the reason is that, as you can imagine, a given fraudster loves privacy, right? They love to hide behind that veil. They love to not share any information. They just want to collect their points and go away. Versus like someone who's more legitimate may be willing to share a little bit more data, and in theory potentially have less privacy, and so on and so forth. So we have to think about that as two sides of a sliding scale. The more you have one, the less you have other, and vice versa. So that's point number one. Point number two that I'd like to share is that it is not coincidental that after the browsers started to be more stringent on privacy, and I would say rightfully so, as well as Europe and of course the US and other countries have followed suit as well, have started to let's say integrate more privacy laws. You have seen the fraud rates rise, right? Over, let's say, 2015, 16. I think the whole GDPR suite that involved Facebook was around that time. And as you can imagine, a lot of you know companies started to implement changes, and the data privacy has the effect of potential other fraudsters trying to hide behind this. Now, interestingly, there is a carve out in GDPR for fraud detection, but let's actually talk about that separately. Now, to answer your question, when we interact with any client, whether they're based in Europe or US or so on and so forth, we like to take a more conservative view and say that actually we do collect PII, right? So that way we are not trying to get around some technicality. So we want to take that responsibility. We work with clients. We ensure that if the client has a UI, for example, the privacy policy is displayed. Of course, we have a privacy policy of our own as well, and we make sure that we follow the rules. And anytime we get a data deletion request, and interestingly, we have gotten a few in the last couple of months or so, we go ahead and simply delete the data, right? But keeping aware that on the flip side, we hope the survey is closed, because once we delete the data, we do not have the ability to track the respondents against that survey anymore, right? So one potential recommendation or advantage that I may share is that you want to try and do it at the survey close, so that way it's not being done in field. So there are some ways to alleviate the pain here. And then the last thing I'd say is that keep in mind that GDPR and CCPA and all the Vermont laws and across the world, none of these have been introduced to stop anyone from doing business. It's there for consumer protection, right? So we're not you know trying to protect anyone to the point of like they cannot do business, obviously. So there are rules and regulations, and I think as long as you follow and check the boxes and make sure that you are saying what you do and not selling the data on the side, like unfortunately some companies have, you would be in good shape.
Makes sense. Thank you, Vignesh. Now, maybe let's zoom out a little bit for the audience. And along with the fraud challenge that we are looking at in the space,
Yep.
what other challenges do you see in the space that research technology vendors like us
Yep.
should address
Yeah.
for good data collection, for good actionable
Yeah,
insights?
well, Sumit, I'm going to say that question is above my pay grade a little bit. Of course, I have I have opinions for sure, but it is an area that I see from a distance. So I'd love to see what you think about it as well. And the first thing that I'll start with is that for me, joining the industry again, like I said many years ago, the CPIs were significantly higher than they are today. And I think that honestly is a challenge, right? And again, I can say this with a fairly clean heart because we don't charge CPIs. So whether the CPIs go up or not, our business model doesn't change. But from what I can tell, this the cost per interview basically has dropped pretty significantly in the last, let's say, 10-15 years, right? And I think that's an issue because, first of all, we have to understand that no product or service in the world gets better with a lower investment, right? Every single industry, whether it can range from chocolate. That's my favorite example. If you want the Hershey's at the 50 cent, yeah, it's there. But if you want the nicer European chocolates, yeah, you're gonna have to pay a few dollars for it, right? And cars, anything, right? Coffee, whatever you choose to use as an example. And I think that shrinking is a pretty strategic challenge for us, I would say. And I think we all should be aware of it and work hard to sort of fight that battle, because ultimately, let's ask ourselves, what would you, me, the person who's standing next to me, or whoever it is, charge per survey? And I'm not sure that the numbers are quite where they need to be. I would say that's one. Secondarily, and again, I wouldn't say this is a challenge per se, but just an interesting thing to note is, given how our supply works, right? It's dynamic. You're finding people across the internet to take surveys. Many suppliers have unique acquisition mechanisms and so on and so forth. Traditional panel, of course, continues to be there, but it is, let's say, it's a smaller part of the pie than it was 10 years ago. So I would say that that industry, or that part of the industry on the supply side, is moving to a probabilistic space, versus on the client side, we are reading every single response that is coming through, right? We want everybody's opinions. We're looking at the open ends, we're looking at the graphs, and we're looking at every single thing, checkbox that the respondent is clicking or using. And that feels more deterministic. So I feel there's a bit of a challenge that on the supply side we're probabilistic, and on the buyer side we're deterministic. And I'm just curious to see how that plays out, because sometimes there's a interesting, you have one leg in one area and the other leg in other area, and there's only so much that you can maneuver when you're standing like that. So I think that's another interesting item, along with the price, that I'd like to see how it evolves in the next 3, 5, 10 years.
Perfect, perfect. And yeah, you asked my question. You asked me a question, so I'm gonna give you
Yeah.
a couple of thoughts because I sit in slightly different chair than you.
Yeah.
So um, I see, improvement in response rates is a perennial battle, right?
Yes.
Since the start of time in this space, you can always ask for better response rates.
Hmm.
Nobody's going to wake up and tell you, hey, my response rates are amazing.
Yes.
Even if it is 5%, you want to go to 10%. If it is 10, you want to go to 15.
Yes.
How do you do that, and how we help solve that challenge in the ecosystem is we provide multiple modes to collect the data,
Yeah.
essentially meet the respondents where they are,
Yes.
right? So based on the demographic, let's say if you wanted to collect data via online surveys or telephone, IVR, face to face,
Yeah.
so we provide them all the different modes. That's number one of the challenges that we help address.
Yeah.
Second big challenge that I see, Vignesh, is collecting data is not a rocket science, right? You can collect the data, but what you do with it is the second biggest part of the puzzle.
Yes.
And I see even many experienced researchers struggling with this. Analyzing data, you can dashboard and get all the reports that you want, but unless you are actioning on the data that is collected, that data is meaningless,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that is where I see the next big piece of the puzzle is helping provide actionable insights and providing people the tools to act upon that more personalized approach. So those are the two areas that I spend a lot of my time at the company, and Voxco does.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited to see how these areas evolve in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Correct. Yes, and then you have the added variable of artificial intelligence as well.
Absolutely.
So you have it on both sides, which is interesting because on one hand, or on the, let's say, on the supply side, you are looking at synthetic respondents and so on and so forth, and arguably, the response rate would be 100%. But the question is whether you want that, right? And I think there is definitely like a place for that. And then secondarily, on the buy side too, like now you have design questionnaires and so on and so forth, which can come through ChatGPT. And I've seen a few demos, and of course I've been playing around with it as well. So I think that's interesting too. Like how do you, I guess, again, just slightly out of my area here, ask you, how do you see that playing out across the ecosystem, not just Voxco?
So, I mean, listen, I think creating, using Chat GPT and other tools to create the surveys is definitely, a cool thing. Let me just say that it's
Yeah,
a trend, and it's definitely something very helpful to cut down on designing a questionnaire.
yeah,
Um, the people, however, that we deal with are very experienced researchers,
yeah,
right? They're asking detailed questions, so
yeah,
they're not asking ChatGPT to design an employee experience survey or a customer experience
sure,
survey as an example.
yeah,
I feel that there's a need for it, absolutely, so we're going to incorporate it
mm-hmm.
into our own technology
Yep,
on the analytics side, on the survey software side.
yep,
But I feel like it's still pretty early stages because of data privacy. We deal with many regulated industries. We need,
yeah,
we have many industries like financial institutions,
yeah,
government
healthcare,
clients,
yeah,
right? Healthcare, as an
yeah,
example.
yeah,
So you're not going to be putting your data on the internet, right?
yes,
Let's just be very clear about that. That is
yes,
not something you should be doing.
yes,
um, so this is a warning sign for people who, I mean, this is exciting, I understand it, but
yeah,
there are guardrails around it. And many of our regulators are now trying to think through what is a proper way to monitor this, right?
yes,
And I am following this space very actively, and I'm very interested in it
yeah,
to see how this evolves and how we are able to incorporate it to basically solve the problems of our users and clients.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, remains to be seen.
yeah, of course.
So, other than AI and Chat GPT, Vignesh, what excites you the most in the research space today, and what are you looking forward to over the next few years?
Yeah. So again, I'll zoom out for this one. Um, Look, I feel that we are currently an underrated and undervalued industry in a way, even though data is out there everywhere, right? So one way that I like to think about how I think important we are as a group, as an entire ecosystem, is the fact that there is no company, or in fact no person in the world, who will tell you that, hey, actually I do not want to know what happens tomorrow, right? I don't care what happens tomorrow or next year, because the rate of you know change is so fast. And if you are unaware of what's going to happen, then frankly that's putting you at a serious disadvantage. And I think that for a while, or for a long time, we have been a peripheral part of the data, let's say industry, whatever that means. um, I think we, in the coming 10 to 15 years, we are going to get very valued. I'm not sure that any business or any company in the world, whether it's small business, big business, public company, yeah, like I said, even individuals, can really navigate the world around them without using software that can help them determine, the consumer preferences and so on and so forth, right? So if you look at a Google or a ChatGPT or whatever these other amazing technologies are, you really, at the best, can get data that is relevant as of today, right? As of this moment. But we sit in a space where we can tell you what the preferences are for tomorrow, right? Or for next year. And I think that's really powerful. So I would say that's really what I think we should be looking at and focusing on. And I'm excited about that for the next 5 to 10 years. And then like you were saying, balancing the needs of humans as well as incoming AI, I think is also going to be interesting and challenging. And I would say it's a very new world out there, and there's a lot of great, products and services and outcomes to be built, and that's really what I'd be looking forward to.
Awesome. Thank you, Vignesh. Really appreciate it. One last question, and we wrap up the podcast. And we always ask
Yeah,
this towards the end from our respected guest.
yeah. Hmm.
What advice do you have for the budding researchers out there who are eager to enter the space, who want to build a career in this space today, like you did? You founded a company. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Again, I would say by nature, be aware that I think there's a lot of, if I may use the word, power in our hands, right? I think that we are the vanguard of a lot of new and cool products and services to be built. Imagine the fact that, like you said, most people today may not be engaging in surveys, but imagine what we could do if the majority of population was engaging in interactions about data and products and so on and so forth, right? So I think the first is the awareness of how important our industry is. I would say that's number one. And number two is, of course, I have listened to your podcast before, and I know a lot of people say this, but I would say, curiosity, open mind is an important thing. By definition, this is the research industry, and everything will and is changing as we speak. And I think awareness of that is also really important. So I would say those two things.
Thank you, Vignesh. Very much appreciated. We enjoyed our conversation with you so much. So, thanks once again for taking the time out to speak with us today. And we would want to get you on a panel with the podcast attendees. We have done that before, and we are going to do that one more time. And we would love to get you back on the podcast. So, thanks once again, and really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit, and thank you to your team as well.
Thank you.